My background is in paleontology. I've been interested in studying extinction for many years with the goal of understanding ancient mass extinction events. And over time, I've been struck by both the similarities and differences between these ancient mass extinction events and the biodiversity crisis that Earth is experiencing today. My goal in speaking with you tonight is to provide this geological perspective on the current biodiversity crisis. And my hope is that it will give you a sense of scale of how what we're experiencing now compares to what's happened in the past, and also some information about how you might think about acting on the current biodiversity crisis. Sitting at home here in California, I'm living in a world that's ecologically emptied relative to the world that would have existed 10 to 15,000 years ago, which from a geological perspective on a planet that's 4.5 billion years old is really an instant. And so 15,000 years ago, I would have needed to worry about large predators such as Smilodon once I stepped out my front door. I no longer need to do that. Smilodon went extinct several thousand years ago. The dodo went extinct in Mauritius in the 1600s. Stellar sea cow, Hydrodamulus, went extinct in the late 1700s. The thylacine, a marsupial predator ecologically similar to a wolf, went extinct in 1934. And so my grandmother, who passed away just 2 years ago, would have been old enough to have seen a living thylacine. Though she grew up in Massachusetts, the thylacine is from Tasmania, so I doubt that she ever did. But all of us, I think, listening to this talk, or nearly all of us, if I've got some young audience members, were alive when the Yangtze River dolphin went extinct in 2006. So the pace of extinction on Earth has been accelerating. It's affecting all kinds of animals, though preferentially large animals. And it represents a very large change in ecosystems and a process that is difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. And so we have the opportunity to stop extinction, but once it happens, we have much less opportunity to reverse it. In summarizing my research, I want to emphasize first and foremost that science is a collaborative discipline. The results that I'll present to you today represent work of others, which I'll provide citations to, but also collaborations with many colleagues over many years. And these include students and postdocs from my lab, such as Jessica Hinojosa, Kim Lau, Matt Knope, and Noel Heim here, collaborators from other institutions who have collaborated with and advised me over many years, such as Dan Lehrman at Trinity University. I understand Dan may even have a few students in the audience tonight. Andrew Bush, who's at the University of Connecticut, Kate Lyons at Nebraska-Lincoln, Felisa Smith at the University of New Mexico, and many others, including some international collaborators, the late Wei Jiayong, Yu Meiyi from the Guizhou University, Demir Altener from the Middle East Technical University. And we've hosted a number of high school students and undergraduates in my lab over the summers. And so some of the data that I'll show you near the end of the talk, we had assistance from these high school and undergraduate students in compiling the data. And in fact, even this summer, we plan to go ahead with a modified high school program to be conducted online so that we can keep our research going even when it's not safe for all of us to be together in the lab room just yet. So when I do this work on extinction, I always want to keep in mind that what we're trying to do here is to reanimate past ecosystems. And that's easy for organisms that went extinct recently, such as the thylacine. This is a video of one of the last living individuals from a zoo in Hobart, Tasmania. But this is the same thing that I'm trying to do when I study a Permian ecosystem. I don't have the luxury of archival video footage, but I'm trying to understand how ecosystems work, how organisms would have interacted, and what kinds of environmental changes may have caused extinction and either slowed or accelerated recovery from extinction. Fossils, when we see them, are sitting there as inert objects, but our goal is to bring back the lives of those organisms. And that, to me, is one of the great achievements of human intellectual history, is that we've recovered 4.5 billion years of Earth's history. over the last 2 centuries, and we can do the same for organisms. So the sixth extinction is a term that, as far as I know, was really first used in public in the mid-1990s by Richard Leakey and Roger Lewin when they published a book on the sixth extinction referring to this current diversity crisis. And because you're not allowed to copyright book titles, Elizabeth Colbert has a book of the same title, a truly excellent book of her journeys learning about different aspects of extinction. And I've learned that the term sixth extinction has really made it into popular culture, in that there is even a band whose name is The Sixth Extinction, with an album entitled The Sixth Extinction. For copyright reasons, I won't be playing you their music, but you're welcome to go online and see what you think. So I'll talk in a little bit about where that term sixth extinction comes from, but I wanted to start with a broader concept, which is the fact that we live on a planet that records its own history. And it records its history in the crust, which is really, you can think of as a scum on the surface of the earth. And so in French, there's not a good distinction between the crust and the scum. And so Claude Allègre, a famous French geologist, wrote a book about plate tectonics called Les Coumes de la Terre, which literally translated in English would be the scum of the earth. That scum, of course, are these layers of rock that we see here in the Grand Canyon. And those layers are deposited over time and therefore record the environments in which they were deposited, as well as often the organisms that were living in those environments. So we're very fortunate to live on a planet that records its own history. This is how we can go back in time. And the world stores information in many different ways. It stores information geologically in the relationships between sedimentary rock layers. One of the most obvious of these being that the oldest layers tend to be on the bottom and the youngest layers are deposited on top of those older layers. The world stores information geochemically as well. The way that we know the age of the Earth is actually from lead isotopes in meteorites. And so we are able to calculate the age of the Earth by measuring distinctive geochemical characteristics, sometimes of rocks or even of very small individual mineral grains. The world stores information biologically in molecules such as DNA, which record the instructions that are needed to grow our bodies and to pass that information on to future generations. And that DNA, of course, can be used to reconstruct evolutionary relationships because the sequences of genes and nucleotides change slowly over time. The same is true of the biogeography of animals, particularly, and of plants and other organisms, particularly prior to humans transporting them all around the planet, so that we can take the spatial relationships among the ranges of different species and understand how continents may have been related to one another in the past, or when and where different groups of organisms are likely to have originated in the geological past. Our brains store information. I couldn't sit here and give this talk to you if my brain wasn't capable of storing enough information to use the slides as cues to talk about different topics. Humans, of course, are unusual in that we store information outside of our bodies. Written language here on the Rosetta Stone has allowed us to put down information in writing that we might forget in our own brains, or we might not have the opportunity to pass along to others, but with written language we can. And of course, in the modern digital age, we're able to store enormous amounts of information in very small spaces on computer chips. And that information can be useful. And this is really the motivation of the research that I do and of giving this talk, is that geology stores not only information, but useful information. And when we teach geology, because we're trying to understand vast intervals of geological time, we often emphasize as teachers the fact that we can use processes we see happening today to interpret the distant past, where we can't see the processes, we just see the outcomes. But in fact, going back even to the origins of modern geology and the writings of James Hutton from the late 1700s, a Scottish geologist, Hutton made a more radical claim, which was that the past is actually the key to seeing the future. That many processes that we see don't extrapolate easily into deep time. We actually need to, if we want to extrapolate far forward, we need to be able to look far back. And his argument was that geology is the tool that allows us to do that. And in this passage, he's writing about seeing the erosion of small islands off of the coast of Scotland, and the fact that he can envision, as those are eroding, that that same process will eventually cause the continent that he's standing on to erode as well. It turns out that that claim is actually probably wrong. The continents don't entirely erode over geological time, but the principle is correct, that the things we can see in the geological past allow us to extrapolate deeper into the future than we could do otherwise. And so the key statement in here is, in tracing those operations which are past, we foresee distant events in the course of things. And there are great examples of this in the geological record. I'll just start with one, which is if we go into deep sea cores, these cores contain small fossil shells that we can measure chemically, and they record climate change in deep time. And this actually allows us to understand how quickly climate will recover from anthropogenic fossil fuel emissions. We have an event that we know of from 55 million years ago, where geochemically we see a change in the oxygen isotope composition of these shells. So this is the amount of oxygen 18, the heavy form of oxygen, versus oxygen 16, the lighter form. And that ratio is temperature sensitive. And so we can see a very rapid warming event and then a gradual cooling in response. And of course, 55 million years ago, there was no opportunity for carbon capture and sequestration in a human engineered sense. And so what we are seeing here is that the Earth has a natural feedback mechanism that takes about 200,000 years, but is capable of removing extra carbon dioxide that was added to the atmosphere. And we can confirm that this warming event is related to a carbon emissions event, similar to the modern, by looking at the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in the same sediments. And the change in that ratio confirms for us that this is a large carbon emissions event, and we know that it's going to take a few 100,000 years to remove that carbon. Those rates on human timescales are so slow that we can't establish that timescale by just looking at weathering happening today. We really need to look into the geological past to understand what that timescale looks like. So the goal of this talk, though, is really less around climate change and much more around extinction. And I've broken the talk up into a few different short lessons so that hopefully if you're not able to pay full attention at every single moment, you can still pull out the lessons that are useful to you. Lesson number one is a very simple one, which is the geological record tells us very clearly that mass extinction events have happened, and therefore, obviously, that they can happen again. There is nothing preventing them. We know this by going through the geological record and looking at the first and last occurrences of different groups of animals and plants and other organisms that make good fossils. And this graph shows one of the best early results on this front. I'm showing geological time going from 600 million years ago on the left over to the present day on the right. And the vertical axis is just the number of different marine animal families that are known from the fossil record. Why marine? Well, the short answer is that the oceans are places where sediments are being deposited, and there are a lot of animals that make shells. And so in general, we actually have a better record of marine animals than of terrestrial animals, because many terrestrial animals die on hillsides and mountains where the sediments are being eroded and their bodies don't have good opportunities to be buried. And so we do have, of course, a fossil record of land-dwelling animals and plants as well, but our marine record is better. And the marine record shows quite clearly that there are 5 major diversity drops across geological time. And Dave Raup and Jack Sepkoski in this 1982 paper called these the Big 5 mass extinctions. And this is the paper that determines why we call the current event the 6th mass extinction. They realized that these changes in diversity could reflect increases in the amount of extinction or potentially decreases in the creation of new families with a standard amount of extinction applying. And so they check this and establish that, yes, indeed, these are extinction crises. If we look at all these gray dots, these are the non-mass extinction intervals. And they called this background extinction. And then they showed that the 5 major mass extinctions have extinction rates that are much higher. And so those drops in diversity are truly created by unusually large amounts of extinction in short intervals of time. One of the big challenges then for geologists since the 1980s, and even going back a little bit before this into the 1950s, has been to understand why these mass extinction events happen. And determining those causes is, of course, critical to understanding how they relate to the current extinction crisis. So lesson number 2 then is that the 6th extinction has not yet reached the magnitude of the other 5, but it could. And there are a few ways of seeing this. One way of seeing this is to look at extinction threat in the modern world. And here, Tony Barnosky and his colleagues at the University of California at Berkeley, our rivals across the bay, did a study where they looked at a range of different groups of organisms, so mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, bony fish, reef-building corals, snails, clams, cycads, a group of plants, conifers, another group of plants, sharks, and crabs and lobsters and their relatives. And they asked in white, what percent have actually gone extinct in historical times, meaning the last 500 years or so? And the good news there is the answer is, in general, very few. It's 1 to a couple percent of species in these groups have gone extinct over the last 5 centuries. The bad news is that several tens of percent of the species in these groups are considered threatened with extinction over the next couple of centuries. And so if all of the threatened species go extinct, we would see a very large loss of biodiversity. Compared to our best estimates for major mass extinction events, where our data are actually at the family and genus level, so aggregations of species, our estimates of species level loss are very high for the biggest mass extinction events, typically above 75% of species. So even losing all of the currently threatened species would create a very large diversity crisis, but not quite as big as these past events. My lab group has looked at this as well for the oceans, looking at mollusks, so clams and snails and their relatives, and vertebrates, mostly fish. And what we tried doing was to do a careful comparison of what's happening now with what's happened in the fossil record, restricting our modern analysis to the genus level and to genera that have fossil records. The challenge with the previous Barnosky figure is that many of the assessed modern species don't have fossil records. And so it's hard to compare what's happening now to the fossil record if we include species that don't have fossil records and maybe don't even have hard parts, and so would never leave a fossil record. So we tried to restrict this analysis to taxa that would leave fossil records and that are analyzed at the same taxonomic level that we typically analyze the fossil data. And we ended up with a very similar conclusion to the Barnosky paper, which is that there are a range of possible outcomes depending on exactly what assumptions we make about how species fit into genera and what we do with species that don't have threat assessments done yet. But we end up in the same place, which is that the most optimistic outcomes would be that we end up with extinction that is not above the geological background for the last 65 million years. But in the more pessimistic scenarios, we can end up with certainly the largest extinction event in the last 65 million years, and maybe an extinction event that rivals the end Cretaceous in magnitude. So it's all about the future. It's all about how things play out and therefore what decisions we make as to how bad the current extinction crisis will become. Very similar to the COVID crisis. Lesson 3 is that current environmental changes resemble those associated with some past mass extinction events, though not all. When I was 5 years old, there was a paper published in Science magazine about the end Cretaceous mass extinction. by Walter and Louis Alvarez, again at UC Berkeley, across the bay from us. And they reported geochemical data that made a strong case for a large asteroid impact event at the end of the Cretaceous as the cause of extinction of the dinosaurs. Pincelli Hull, she's an assistant professor at Yale University right now, has a great paper in Science just this year strengthening this case. And that event happened on a bad Thursday afternoon, hopefully not at exactly 7:20 in the evening, but it was very large and very rapid. The energy of impact was on the order of 500,000 times the energy of all the nuclear devices we have ever detonated. It was a huge crisis, but one that was fairly different in how it played out from the current diversity crisis. By contrast, the end Permian mass extinction, which I had the privilege of working on for my PhD work with colleagues from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, Dan Lehrman now at Trinity, as well as from colleagues at the Guizhou Geological Survey and Guizhou University, Wei Jiayong and Yu Mei Yi and others. The end Permian mass extinction turns out to have more resemblance to the current environmental changes. And so we can see this in the geochemical record, which I'll come back to and explain in a minute. We tried recreating the Alvarez type photo. Ellen Schall was a PhD student at Stanford. Katya Meyer was a postdoc. Xiaowei Li is a current student previously from Guizhou University, now finishing up at Stanford. And Fu Hongbin was a master's student at Guizhou University as we were doing this fieldwork in 2008 in Guizhou province. And we have a lot of evidence for a terrestrial cause. And this is a good moment to talk about the modern, where in the modern oceans, there are really three big changes that we worry about that are referred to by modern animal physiologists as the deadly trio, because all of them act on animal metabolism. One is global warming, another is ocean acidification, and a third is ocean deoxygenation, the loss of oxygen from seawater. And we now geochemically and geologically have evidence of all of these processes operating at the end of the Permian. We are able to get temperatures, as I noted earlier in the talk, by looking at the isotopes of oxygen in rocks and fossils. In this case, this is a study of a series of rocks. So the oldest rocks are on the bottom, youngest rocks are on the top. And we're measuring what are essentially fossil fish teeth, so not too different from your own teeth. They're made of calcium phosphate, which is fairly resistant to chemical alteration during burial, which is good for us as geologists because we're looking at material that's been buried sometimes several kilometers below the Earth's surface at some point and is 250 million years old. What we can see here is that the isotope composition changes rapidly as we go across the extinction interval, here this blue line, indicating a warming of tropical sea surface by as much as maybe 10 degrees centigrade. So this is a very, very large warming. And it's occurring at the same time that we have, again, carbon isotope evidence for a big disturbance of the carbon cycle. And this carbon isotope evidence, like the modern, and like this Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum that I showed you earlier, is indicative of a large carbon release event. We have evidence of acidification in a couple of somewhat indirect ways. One is that we see preferential extinction. This is work by Andy Knoll. Preferential extinction of heavily calcified animals that would be more sensitive to acidification in terms of their ability to make their shells, as well as their ability to keep their internal body fluid pH at a value that they would like it to be at. Animals with lighter calcium carbonate skeletons went extinct at lower rates, though still high, 54% of genera went extinct. And then the animals with little or no calcium carbonate skeleton went extinct only at 5%. Sample size is a bit smaller, but we have a clear gradient from heavily calcified being hit hard to lightly calcified being hit much less. And in geochemical work that built out of samples collected in China and in Turkey in collaboration with Yu Yi, Dan Lehrman, Demir Altener at the Middle East Technical University, and Wei Jiayong. Kimberly Lau, who is a PhD student at Stanford University, did a study looking at uranium concentrations and uranium isotopes in these limestones. And this was a really neat study in that it built on work from other universities, showing that we can use uranium not only as a radioactive clock in ancient geological materials, but that we can also actually use other kinds of measurements of uranium as a way of figuring out how much oxygen was in seawater in the geological past. It turns out that the amount of uranium, over here plotted on the right, as well as the ratio of uranium-238 isotope to the rarer uranium-235 isotope, both of those values are sensitive to the amount of oxygen that was in seawater. And so in this study, we were able to show that there's a change in the isotope ratio to the left, to more negative values, and there's a change in the concentration to lower values. And that is exactly what we would expect to see if there was a rapid and large decline in the amount of oxygen available in seawater. We would expect that kind of outcome in a world that warms very rapidly, because just in the same way that if we heat up a soda or a beer, we drive dissolved gases, in that case carbon dioxide, out of the liquid, the same thing happens to oxygen. In a warmer world, it's harder to dissolve oxygen into the water, which makes it harder for animals to breathe. At the same time, the warming that we saw evidence of makes the animals need more oxygen. It causes their respiration processes to go more quickly, so they need more oxygen. Unlike us, where we regulate our body temperatures at a constant value over time, most marine animals have their body temperatures just go up and down with the water around them. And now, geologically, we understand the cause of the end Permian extinction. So we understand that there was warming and acidification, and we think where the carbon dioxide ultimately comes from. It appears to come from a very large volcanic province in Siberia, referred to as the Siberian Traps, from I believe a Dutch word meaning staircase, because the lava flows, when they're eroded, erode into a staircase pattern along the sides of river gorges. And the Soviets and now the Russians have known for a long time that there is evidence of gas explosions coming out of these volcanic eruptions, because those gas explosions are associated with magnetite, which is an iron ore. So these gas explosion structures are economically important as iron ore deposits. Biologically or paleontologically, they're important because they indicate that there were these very large gas release events all across this province that's 1,000 kilometers plus in dimension in both directions. And that lava by itself would have had a moderate amount of carbon dioxide, but it had the privilege, or from an animal perspective, the misfortune of heating up a whole bunch of sedimentary rocks in the crust as it came toward the surface. And those rocks had sulfur in them, they had carbon in them, and as they were being heated up, these limestones and evaporites would have released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere. And this is why this volcanic province was such bad news for the planet, is that it released enormous amounts of gas into the atmosphere that affected climate and ocean chemistry, and caused the changes that we see. So for the end Permian, the deadly trio is there. We might have had as much as 10 degrees Celsius of warming, maybe as much as a whole pH unit decrease in the pH of seawater, and maybe as much as a 100-fold increase in the number of anoxic regions across the global ocean. So many similarities, but there are also differences, and the differences really come out in ecology. And so lesson number 4 is that the 6th extinction has an ecologically unique pattern. And this is work that my lab group has done with the help of many undergraduates and high school students, where we've been compiling data about the ecology of different marine animals. We've been measuring body sizes to find out if big species or small species are more at risk of extinction. We have been coding species as being predators or prey, or non-predators, I should say, as an ecological predictor of extinction. We've looked at marine animals that live in the water column versus those that live on the seafloor. And we've looked at those that move around in their adult life form versus those that sit non-moving on the seafloor in their adult life form. We've done this again with help from many high school interns, as well as I should point out here, Noel Heim in the back with the glasses. Noel is now a lecturer at Tufts University, was a research scientist at Stanford for 7 years, and really was the force running this big high school program, compiling the data, and Noel and I worked together on a number of different projects analyzing the data. What I'm going to do here is, I don't have a great way of giving you good visuals other than output from regression models. So the basic idea is we're trying to figure out how a trait such as body size is associated with extinction risk. And that trait might have zero association, meaning that there is no relationship between body size and extinction, or we might have selective loss of large animals, or we might have selective loss of small animals. And so when we run a regression model, we get a point estimate and we get uncertainty estimates. And basically what we end up saying is that if the uncertainty bounds cross zero, we don't have any strong evidence that there's any selectivity. If the error bars don't cross zero, then we can have cases of selective loss of small animals or selective loss of large animals. When we go into the geological record, what we see for the last 65 million years, so looking at every time interval since the end Cretaceous mass extinction, is that in our simple coding of ecology, and it's knowingly simple because in fossil animals, the amount that we know about ecology is less than what we know about a living species that we can observe well. The good news is that over time, lots and lots of species leave fossils. And so we actually have a lot of information about which species are around and how their relative abundances are changing over time. But what we find is that feeding mode, predators versus non, motility, habitat zone, have relatively little association with extinction. And body size, much to our surprise, what we found was that smaller genera tended to go extinct preferentially, if anything, during the 65 million years of background processes. When we looked at the modern, here in red, what we found was that some aspects of what we saw were basically the same. There is still no effective feeding, no association with habitat zone. Maybe some association with motility, though this depended a little bit on how we coded motility. Definitely an association with body size. Larger body size is very strongly associated with higher extinction threat in the modern. And this shows up no matter what we do with the data set. So we're quite confident that this is a strong signal in the data set and not an artifact of how we treated the data. We then went and looked at the previous major mass extinction events and found fairly similar things. The end Cretaceous extinction is a little different with respect to motility. It looks like the non-motile species were actually preferentially victimized. The other thing, the smaller body genera went extinct preferentially, as we saw in the other analysis. The one big difference we saw was that animals that live up in the water column were at higher risk of extinction in these ancient mass extinction events. When we looked into this further, what we found was that that's true of all of the time intervals before the end Cretaceous mass extinction event, whether they were major mass extinction events or whether they were background intervals. And it really relates to the fossil record of ammonites, a shelled group of cephalopods with very high extinction rates that went entirely extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. And so once they're out of the data set, being in the water column versus being on the seafloor doesn't seem to matter anymore. So this is not a mass extinction signal. This is a difference between the fossil record before the end Cretaceous mass extinction and afterward. And again, for comparison, the modern extinction looks ecologically quite different. That's the oceans. On land, we see the same thing. So this is a paper led by Felisa Smith at the University of New Mexico. I was very fortunate that Felisa asked if I would collaborate on some of the analyses here, and so I was a co-author on this study. What Felisa was able to do here, using data that she and Kate Lyons had compiled, was to show that, as was already known, that animals have gotten bigger, terrestrial mammals have gotten bigger, I should say, over the last 65 million years. The largest mammals have gotten bigger on every continent. But if we go down and look at the bottom panel here, what we see is that there's very little size selectivity and extinction in mammals across that 65 million year interval. So the geological background is that for mammals, large or small body size is not a good predictor of extinction threat. Then when we zoom in on the last 120,000 years as compared to the last 65 million years, we see a big change. We see the average sizes of mammals getting much smaller on every continent. We see the maximum sizes getting smaller to the point that if all threatened mammals went extinct, domestic cows would be the largest terrestrial mammal on the planet. And this is happening because of massive selectivity of extinction against larger bodied mammals. That selectivity is particularly pronounced up until about 5 to 10,000 years ago. And it actually becomes a little bit weaker when we look at extinctions in the last 500 years and projected extinctions based on extinction threat in the modern. Our interpretation here is that up until 5 to 10,000 years ago, extinction of large-bodied mammals was almost exclusively driven, or I should say, extinction of mammals was almost exclusively driven by hunting from humans. That hunting was for food in the case of large-bodied herbivores, and to remove competitors and pests in the case of large-bodied carnivores. What we see, I think, going toward the present is that there are now additional drivers of extinction in mammals that are not as size selective, such as climate change and land use change. And that is causing the size bias of extinction to actually decrease toward the present and into the future. But the basic lesson is that ecologically, the modern is very different from the ancient, both on land and in the oceans. And interestingly, this is really an answer to a debate that's been in the literature, scientific literature on evolution ever since Darwin. And Alfred Russel Wallace, who I'm sure many of you will know, was a co-discoverer, independent discoverer of the idea of evolution by natural selection, along with Darwin. Wallace really thought about this, and in his book on what he calls Darwinism, or evolution by natural selection, he has a section devoted to cause of extinction of large animals. The reason being that when extinction was first discovered in the fossil record, namely the idea that some of these species that we're seeing are certainly not alive on the planet today, these were almost all mammals from the last million or 2 million years, sometimes even just the last 100,000 years, and they were all large-bodied. These were mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths that are of similar kinds of proportions. And so early thinking on extinction was devoted to understanding why large animals go extinct preferentially. And Wallace wrote a whole section on this, hypothesizing that larger mammals need more food, have fewer offspring, have longer generation times, and so are going to respond much more slowly to environmental changes. And this wisdom has permeated conservation biology for many decades because it makes a lot of sense and based on the biology, and it accords with what we're seeing happening in the modern world and what we see happening in recent extinctions. What's interesting in our fossil studies is that this pattern and conventional wisdom appears to be based on a geologically unique extinction event relating to the last couple 100,000 years since the evolution of anatomically modern humans. The rest of the geological record doesn't show this pattern at all. And so we actually need a new conventional wisdom to understand why extinction hasn't been size biased for the 600 million years of animal evolution prior to the current extinction crisis. Um, I wanted to start wrapping up by talking about why this matters in modern ecosystems. And the basic answer here is that large animals matter because they're big and because they move over long distances. Those two things combined mean that large animals move nutrients, um, more nutrients over longer distances than smaller animals. And so on average, they have bigger effects on productivity, nutrient cycling, and ecosystem dynamics than their smaller counterparts. One fun example of this is what Joe Roman and Jim McCarthy have termed the whale pump, which is basically the idea that in some coastal ecosystems, in this case, a study of the Gulf of Maine, what they find is that whales and seals as well feed at moderate water depths, but their fecal material is warm and therefore buoyant in the cold water. And so their fecal matter floats right to the surface where the nutrients are available to the phytoplankton to create new food. And so the whale activity actually accelerates the recycling of nutrients in the ecosystem relative to what the ecosystem would look like without the whales. In other words, it makes the ecosystem more productive for everybody. Another great example of this that applies on both coasts as well as other systems with rivers are fish that live in the oceans but reproduce in rivers. The salmon are a great example. When they swim upriver to lay their eggs, they become food for bears and for other animals in terrestrial ecosystems. But the phosphorus and nitrogen nutrients in their bodies were all acquired in the oceans. And so geologists tend to think of nutrients as being removed from rocks on land by chemical processes and dumped into the oceans by rivers. But it turns out that biology, especially the biology of large animals, can reverse those processes and take the nutrients out of the oceans and send them back up the rivers in the case of salmon and other anadromous fish. A world without these large animals functions very differently in terms of nutrient cycling. And in general, these animals recycle nutrients. They accelerate the reuse of nutrients. Losing them from ecosystems in that sense is bad news. And so to finish up, that's all bad news. I wanted to finish on a note of hope because there is hope for sure. And I think we're seeing this with the COVID crisis, where we can see that human actions taken widely can, in the case of a virus, over the span of weeks to months, have a massive effect on the transmission of the virus and its outcome for humans. And the same is true, maybe on slightly longer timescales, for conservation biology. And in the oceans, one of the great examples of this, that's a local example for me, is the northern elephant seal. Pictured here, a large male. The elephant seal was nearly extinct 100 years ago. It's been estimated that at the very lowest, the global population of northern elephant seal was 20 to 40 individuals. At that point, and the reason they were being hunted is that a single large male like this could yield hundreds of gallons of oil that could be used for fuel. At the point where we got to 20 to 40 individuals, the governments of Mexico and the US started putting moratoria on the hunting of the elephant seal. And very fortunately, the other aspects of the seal's ecosystem were still enough intact that this conservation measure had a dramatic effect, such that there are now over 200,000 individuals of the northern elephant seal on the planet. And it's easy if you're out in California, and I hope all of you will have a chance to travel here at some point in the not too distant future. You can go out to beaches and from a distance or on a guided tour, have an opportunity to see colonies of elephant seals on the beaches where they have their young. And so this is a spectacular conservation success story. I don't pretend to think that every species can have the same outcome. But the good news here is that climate change is going to be slow to turn around. Ocean acidification probably even slower. But to the extent that modern extinction threat is still driven in large part by overhunting, overfishing, and land use change. Those are processes where political action can change the circumstances for species very quickly. And because populations, just like the coronavirus, can increase exponentially, we have the opportunity to have very rapid positive response if we take the right actions for conservation and take them widely and take them quickly. So to wrap up, we've got some good news in that we are not at the level of the 6th major mass extinction event yet, even though we could get there. Bad news, we're in an ecological pattern that is unprecedented in the history of life. So the ecology of the current extinction event doesn't have a good counterpart in the rock record, even though the environmental circumstances do. And I mentioned this point about being able to reverse overexploitation. And so just to answer your question then, I hope, of, what can you do? There are a few different things that you can do. One is to vote. Conservation requires political action. We're certainly seeing this again in the COVID crisis. I think it highlights better than anything I could have said in this talk how important political leadership is in the decision-making about how we address global problems at the local, state, and national and international level. So know what your different political leaders propose to do about the biodiversity crisis and vote accordingly. You can donate. Your energy, your time, your money can all help organizations devoted to different aspects of the response to diversity loss and climate change. There are many different organizations that do this, and so I encourage you to do some research and find one that does work that's meaningful to you. And if there's more that you'd like to learn, I already highlighted Elizabeth Kolbert's book, The 6th Extinction, which is terrific. David Quammen's book, Song of the Dodo, is equally fantastic. And here are a few more that I think are also excellent. Song of the Dodo, 6th Extinction, Future Eaters are all about, and Future of Life are all about the modern extinction. If you want a more fossil record perspective, Dave Raup's book, Extinction, Bad Genes or Bad Luck, is a great introduction. And Doug Irwin's book, Extinction, which is about this end Permian event that I discussed, is another great one. I want to make sure there's time for questions, so I'll stop there.
And we do have a few questions, and I want to remind our viewers that you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that, type in your questions, and I will read them to Dr. Payne. There's one question I can answer. This is from Josie, I believe, who says, fantastic lecture, thanks. May I tweet about it? And the answer, of course, yes, please do. And we will have a recording of tonight's program available on our website at lindahlhall.org in the next day or two as well. Now, John has a question. There is a significant loss in mean body mass for Australian regime compared to others between Pleistocene to Holocene. Could you please explain the possible reason for it?
Yeah, so let me see if I can get that quickly enough to the slide. There we go. So the answer there, I think in large part, is the early arrival of humans in Australia relative to North and South America. Africa seems to behave a little bit differently. And has had fewer extinctions for reasons that are debatable, I think, about whether it's coevolution between humans and the wildlife, or the extent of development of human populations in Africa. But I think the key comparison here is Australia versus North and South America. We know that there were humans in Australia by, say, 40,000 years ago, whereas North America probably not prior to about 15,000 years ago, or even a little bit after that. And that's the big difference here, is that the human arrival always seems to coincide with a fairly rapid reduction in large-bodied mammals. in particular in places like North, South America and Australia, because the species that were there would have been naive to humans or anything quite similar to humans before our arrival. And so at least early on, they would not have had behavioral adaptations to get out of the way.
Right, Dr. Payne, do you have any comments on how the current extinctions of insects will affect other organisms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should start off by saying that, in many cases, insects are a challenge because we don't have good threat assessments for many of the species, and there are enormous numbers of species. There are some studies indicating that the population sizes of many species are being reduced, and there's certainly evidence in well-studied groups like butterflies and dragonflies of threat and extinction. Insects are so diverse and do so many different things in ecosystems that the precise outcomes will undoubtedly depend on which insect species we're thinking about and what it does in ecosystems. A couple key examples, one would be pollinator species, that this will affect the pollination of plant species, in some cases in ways that may be harmful to humans, where we depend on insect pollinators to pollinate crops. There are also examples, I think, that are more speculative but potential, where groups like dragonflies can be predators on other insects that are disease vectors, such as mosquitoes. And so there's the possibility that the loss of insect predators on other insects could have a negative impact on humans, in the sense that they allow population increase in disease vectors. Within the ecosystems, undoubtedly, there will be other feedbacks that have nothing to do with humans one way or the other in terms of the relative abundances of different species.
All right, this is from Georgie. Do you have any ideas on the likelihood of extinction of human beings? I know this may seem a little fantastical, but there is a lot of discussion around whether climate change is or will be the cause of our extinction.
Right. I'd separate that question into two parts. I think that when we talk about climate change and the biodiversity crisis, as far as I understand it, I don't view those as threats to the human species in terms of our species going entirely extinct. They are certainly threats to our way of life. That if we enjoy first world living, and we hold values that may say that we hope that all humans on the planet can live in that way, climate change and the biodiversity crisis are threats to that, because they affect our ability to produce enough food. They affect our ability to live in many parts of the planet. And as we're seeing right now, the reason that I'm giving this talk online and that all of our lives are dramatically curtailed is that the intense interactions between humans and wildlife provide opportunities for diseases such as viruses to jump host species from an animal host into a human host. And in those cases, because we have naive immune systems, those viruses can be enormous threats to us. So those are all threats to our way of life. They're unlikely to wipe out the entire species, I think, over the next couple thousand years anyway. But I'm much more worried about threats to our ability for all people to live healthy and productive and satisfying lives on the planet. Humans will undoubtedly go extinct at some point, right? Within a few billion years, it's questionable whether Earth will be habitable at all to animals. And so if we're not extinct, we'll be living on some other planet. And I'm not super optimistic about that, but I think within the timescales most of us think about, I'm not super worried about us going extinct entirely.
Well, that's a bit of good news. In regards to size selectability, has the effect of body shape, such as with Allen's rule, within the same size been examined?
Not that I'm aware of. I think once you get down to sizes that are fairly comparable, it's probably other aspects of ecology that end up mattering more. Where you live, how close that is to human populations, what sort of feeding strategies you have, what other organisms and ecosystems you depend upon. So I can't think offhand of a study that's looked at that though I can't promise that it's never been done. But I don't think that's a big effect.
Okay, Carl would like to know the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction would obviously be an example of an abrupt mass extinction event. For the other big four extinctions, how well do we have estimates of their speed or duration as compared to current extinction rates?
Right, that's a wonderful question. The end Cretaceous, yeah, I mean, a lot of the action happened in a couple of days, and presumably almost everything occurred in the timescale of a year or a couple decades. For the end Permian extinction that I've spent a lot of time on, we can now establish that at most that extinction event took a few tens of thousands of years. We're getting similar kinds of constraints on the extinction event at the end of the Triassic. The extinction events, the two earliest ones, the one in the Ordovician period and the one in the Devonian period, are a little more poorly constrained, but still clearly under 1 million years, probably substantially less than that. And so in that sense, the timescales become fairly similar to what we're experiencing today. We're obviously living through an acceleration of this, but if I were a paleontologist coming back in 10 million years, I would probably be saying something similar, that this extinction event is playing out over a time scale that's thousands to maybe a couple tens of thousands of years.
Here's a question of one of my favorite topics. It's from Don, who asks, there is a major lava pool under Yellowstone National Park. If that erupts, could it be similar to the past eruption in Russia?
It's on a very different scale. It's actually much smaller. The eruptions in Siberia, we should think of as a series of eruptions from a large volcanic province that played out over a few 100,000 years. But during that time, we're more than doubling the amount of volcanism globally year after year after year after year. And that's why they were able to put so much gas into the atmosphere and change climate. In the case of a Yellowstone caldera eruption, those events happen about every 500,000 years. And so we know there are lots and lots of them over Earth history. They're not the causes of big mass extinction events, but they do have the potential to have massive effect on human life. We know from our own experience, many of you will remember the eruption in Iceland from the Eyjafjallajökull volcano that put a lot of ash into the atmosphere and shut down air travel for quite a while. We know historically of eruptions of Krakatoa and Tambora, and in prehistory of the Toba volcano in Indonesia. Each of these eruptions caused human deaths through air pollution. They affected climate on the timescale of a year or two, as did Mount Pinatubo in 1991. In the case of Tambora in the early 1800s, I think 1815, 1816, it affected climate enough to affect crop yields and actually caused some human crisis that way. A Yellowstone eruption would be much larger than those and would cause massive crop loss in North America, where we grow lots and lots of wheat. It would undoubtedly shut down air travel for a substantial period. And so some of the same supply chain issues that we're seeing today from COVID would exist in that kind of eruption, as well as health impacts from all of the ash coming down in the air, restrictions on travel, and probably food supply issues from the loss of crop growth across much of North America, if not further.
All right, we have a question from Margaret, who writes that she may have missed it, but what led to extinction of mammoths and more recent but pre-human mammals?
Right. So mammoths, mastodons, Smilodon, many of these others clearly coexisted in places with humans. In some cases, we have direct evidence of humans hunting and killing these mammals. And so there's still some argument about how much effect the additional climate warming during this interval had. But from my point of view, the fact that the timing always lines up on different continents when humans arrive and only sometimes lines up with climate change indicates that it's human hunting of these species that's the big problem. John Alroy, who's a paleontologist at Macquarie University in Australia, has done some really nice numerical modeling showing that if year after year humans just cause a little bit of excess death over birth, it doesn't take too long to collapse the populations of these species. So we don't need to imagine this happening in a year or two. it may have happened over many generations of humans to the point that any given human generation without scientific records wouldn't have even known the difference. And so that's the tough part about this is it's geologically very fast, but it's slow enough that if you're not doing science, you might not know the difference.
All right, we're a little past 8 o'clock, so due to the time, let's make this the last question. Paula writes, you mentioned that during one of the mass extinctions, there was a loss of 75% of biodiversity. After that time period, did a lot of new species develop?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question, one to give us hope in the long term, right? That in some sense, we wouldn't be here if the dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct. So in the geological long term, extinction actually appears to create many new opportunities. What I mean by the geological long term is, say, timescales of more than 1 million to 5 million years. So they're not relevant to policy making for humans. They're only relevant, if you really have a planetary perspective. So it takes a long time to recover diversity, but there does appear to be an increase in diversification after extinction events. It's just very long. And so it's not something from a policy-making standpoint that we would ever want to count on as our approach to recovery. It won't happen for us that way.
Well, Dr. Payne, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you for the invitation, Eric. It's been a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that I can't see any of the audience reactions, but I'm glad to get these great questions, and I hope I'll be able to make a visit in person someday in the future.
I was going to say, we'll have to bring you to Kansas City soon.
I sure hope so. Wishing everyone good health.
Yes, and thank you everyone for attending tonight's program, and go to lindahall.org, and we hope to see you back here at a future program soon. Thank you and good night.